King David is one of the most recognizable figures in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are few better places to start when making videos on the Old Testament than an ancestor of Christ that, in spite of his flaws, served God with a complete heart. For now, I'll devote 2 videos to 11 topics on David. The first will be more general, the second a bit more into red pill territory, though pure manosphere focus and analysis would probably come in subsequent revisits. Let's begin today's video with a bit on David and the Sword of Goliath. We all remember the story. The Philistines' towering champion Goliath offers the Israelites a challenge and taunts them. The faithless Israelites are paralyzed in cowardice as a young shepherd boy boldly answers the call, declaring, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to thee in the name of Jehovah of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied," promptly striking the giant down with a stone slung to his forehead. After Goliath fell slain, David rushed to him and severed his head with his own sword. David kept the sword, and it remained in the land for centuries. David was probably an average-sized man. Saul was a head taller than all the Israelites. But David was hardly the most towering of the sons of Jesse, so you could just imagine this warrior going off into battle over the following decades with his huge sword meant for someone over 9 foot tall. It would have been quite the workout. Its durability would have given him an advantage over the average Israelite warrior. When Jeremiah hid the Ark of the Covenant, he also placed Goliath's sword, a 5'2" blade, in Jeremiah's grotto. To put that size in perspective, lightsabers are 3 feet long, and when you see Vader's extend in The Empire Strikes Back, it reaches 4 feet. This blade was over 5 feet long. There might have been a bit of an Excalibur-ish superstition at one point in relation to the sword, or it could have even somewhat inspired that part of Arthurian legend. The Jews in the days of the Roman rule would have loved a warrior messiah, and the descendant of David with the sword would probably have been embraced as king. This is probably why the sword was hidden. What else was significant about it in the Philistines? The Philistines were a Hamitic people that were at least one time a maritime power. They appear prone to genetic conditions that occasionally resulted in gigantism, though not as dramatic a form as the Nephilim, perhaps a predisposition to the glandular dysfunction responsible for pituitary gigantism. An elevated rate of genetic abnormality is suggested by one of their warriors possessing 6 fingers on each hand and 6 on each toes on each foot. They were technologically advanced at the time, manufacturing iron tools and weapons, as well as chariots enhanced with iron scythes. While most of the world, including the Israelites, had not yet left the Bronze Age, they had to rely on God for their victories. In fact, the Philistines respected this advantage enough during the time of the judges that they enforced a monopoly on ironwork. Blacksmithing and the teaching of iron metallurgy was prohibited in Israel. They would have to go to the Philistines to have their farm implements produced or repaired. I'll be covering a few of David's mightiest warriors in a moment. But first, in discussing just how distinguished these men were on the battlefield, I'll use a single battle as a reference point. Much respect is given to the prowess of the ancient Greeks. When Alexander the Great led them in battle against the Persians, they often won battles greatly outnumbered. But though the pinnacle of human achievement in that path, they were dwarfed by the average of what David's men could do, with the creator behind them who could stand against them. During the civil war between David and Saul's son Ishbosheth, David's forces, composed mostly of the tribe of Judah, with a few defectors from other tribes and probably some Gentile allies like the Charitized and Pelaptites, fought a decisive battle. Though the victory was David's, he lost his nephew Asahel to the enemy general Abner. David's forces would have been greatly outnumbered. They were facing the forces of the majority of the warriors of the Israelites. But at the end of the battle, David lost 20 men and Abner 660. That's a ratio of 33 kills to every soldier lost. I'm hardly here to glorify war, but when you realize that figure was not that of some elite, but the average of his forces, it does well to illustrate how you'll be looked after with God at your right hand. No wonder David spoke of God as his armor-bearer. When it comes to David's most distinguished warriors, there is little better place to start than the three. Jashobium Basshebeth was leader of the three, a descendant of Levi, specifically a Korahite, and of Judah, of his son Perez's line. It's unclear Jashobium's exact kill count for his career, though he is credited with slaying 300 and 800 enemies in individual battles. During a battle with the Philistines at Ephes Dammim, Jashobium, along with Eleazar and Shammah, taunted the Philistines. The Israelite army retreated in fear, but the three defeated the Philistine army themselves in a barley field. While David was encamped in the cave of Adullam on a campaign against the Philistines, who were garrisoned in Bethlehem, Jashobium, as part of the three, broke the Philistine line to reach a well near Bethlehem's gate to get David a drink. However, David poured the water out, saying, "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" As for Eleazar, second of the three, the account in 2 Samuel says, "And after him was Eleazar the son of Dodai, the son of an Ahohite, one of the three mighty men with David, when they defied the Philistines that were gathered together to battle, and the men of Israel were gone away. He arose and smote the Philistines until his hand was weary. His hand clave unto the sword. And Jehovah wrought a great victory that day, and the people returned after him, only to take spoil." The record on Shammah, the third of the three, states, "And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi, a Hararite. And the Philistines were gathered together into a troop, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils. And the people fled from the Philistines. But he stood in the midst of the plot, and defended it, and slew the Philistines. And Jehovah wrought a great victory." Of course, there was also Abishai. Abishai was one of David's nephews. They were fairly seasoned warriors, a bit overzealous as well. David once was left saying, "What am I to do with you sons of Zeruiah?" Abishai led a battle in the Valley of Salt, where 18,000 Edomites were defeated. He also played part in the slaying of 4 giant Philistines of the Rephaim subset. He saved David's life from the giant Isbi-Benob, whose spear weighed 300 shekels, and was armed with a new sword, at which point the men urged David to cease fighting, as he had grown older. Abishai was chief of the 30, and is credited with taking out 300 with his spear. Then there was Benaiah. Benaiah was one of the elites that remained loyal to David and Solomon, even as David reached death. He carried out their execution orders, eliminating Joab, Adonijah, and Shimei. He was appointed by David as head of his bodyguards, the Charitized and Pelaptites. Benaiah himself was the son of the priest Jehoiada, a descendant of Aaron. Benaiah's feats included slaying 2 of Moab's best men with reputations compared to lions, slaying an actual lion in a pit on a snowy day, and slaying a 7.5-foot tall Egyptian, initially armed with only a little club. He used the Egyptian's own spear against him. Finally, there's the Charitized and Pelaptites. You know that old saying, if you can't beat them, join them? Well, that's the Charitized and Pelaptites in a nutshell. These warriors were among David's most trusted men, forming part of his bodyguard. Yet everything points to them being either a subset or close kin of the Philistines. This would indicate that not only had David acquired the respect of these Gentile loyalists that persisted in supporting Solomon's claim to the kingship, but this respect went the other way as well. In his younger years, the thought of having Philistines in the army would have repulsed David. When Goliath was making a scene, what did David say? "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the battle line of the living God?" David was uninterested in marrying any of Saul's daughters till the proposed bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins tempted him with breaking the routine of shepherding his flocks. Having Philistine warriors at David's disposal showed David perhaps recalling some of his ancestors were non-Israelites, or maybe having interacted with the Gibeonites and Kenites that revered his God, he had overcome any prejudices of his youth. As the Apostle Peter said upon overcoming his own biases, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." In the genealogy of Christ Jesus in the book of Matthew, attention is drawn to Solomon being a son of David by the wife of Uriah. Why was Uriah mentioned? Because on the first day after this mess we're living through is over, the day everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, when those in the memorial tombs make their exit like Lazarus, Uriah will be back, and Bathsheba will once again be his spouse. On to the instance of David's presumptuousness. David's great sins all occurred after he'd been forced by his troops to retire from active duty in the army, after Abishai saved him from the giant. David erred severely several times, and on one of them, in one respect, he acted like Saul, allowing his insecurity to lead to a faithless act of presumptuousness. And as the prophet Samuel said, presumptuousness is the same as the sin of divination. Whether frightened by an enemy force, or having lost confidence now that he was aged and removed from the action, or impotent from his position, his faith had waned, and Satan found an opportunity. The adversary incited David to order a census of all the fighting men of the land. Joab knew it was wrong and expressed his displeasure, even calling the act a cause of guilt. But he ultimately carried the order out, with the exception of the Levites and Benjamites. David did come to his senses. The account says he felt guilt, but of course it was too late. God offered the king 3 punishments. So Gad came in to David and said to him, "This is what Jehovah says. Take your pick, whether there should be 3 years of famine, or 3 months of being swept away by your adversaries, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or 3 days of the sword of Jehovah, pestilence in the land, with Jehovah's angel bringing destruction in all the territory of Israel. Now consider what I should reply to the one who sent me." So David said to Gad, "It is very distressing to me. Please let me fall into the hand of Jehovah, for his mercy is very great. But do not let me fall into the hand of man." So Jehovah sent a pestilence upon Israel, and there fell of Israel 70,000 men. And God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was about to destroy, Jehovah beheld and felt regret over the calamity, and said to the destroying angel, "It is enough, now stay thy hand." David offered sacrifices, and the crisis ended, but the damage was done. This is a strong lesson for us. We might see character flaws in other people, feel like so-and-so is a Saul of sorts. But when we are in the same position, and circumstances promote it, do we or would we manifest the same defect? David's fear made him vulnerable, as it will you when it rears its head. Fear leads to egocentrism, and when we operate in that frame, a state of panic, of putting ourselves before others, we can easily find our faith wanting, or victimize others. Food for thought. Never think the Creator doesn't care about how you carry on in your life. However we feel about the loss suffered on that day, it shows how much one man's heart can affect the source of all things. David was one of few biblical figures specifically connected with music. His heart was naturally drawn toward praising God in song and melody. He is credited with half of the songs and might have written more. His skill was distinguished enough that he was recommended to King Saul to soothe him with the harp, and he did for some time. Music was a priority in respect to worship. Under David's rule, he ordered the heads of the Levitical families to appoint an orchestra and choir to accompany the transportation of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Then, for the regular performance of music at the time of the daily burnt offerings, in 2 locations, one under Asaph before the ark, and one under Herman and Jeduthun in Gibeon. At the end of his reign, David expanded upon this arrangement in preparation for Solomon's temple. He appointed 24 leaders, each for a division of the Levitical priesthood. Initially, each division of the priesthood had among its members a dozen musicians trained in the lyre, harp, and cymbal. We do not have the privilege of any audio recordings of David's work and compositions, of course only his lyrics. But according to a passage in Amos, David even invented musical instruments. So he was not only a talented man, but a creative mind when it came to the field of music. As an example of a man whose heart was complete toward God, David was certainly a well-rounded individual. That concludes part 1. I hope you enjoyed the content and learned a few things along the way. If you found it worthwhile, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, donate, and comment if you're so inclined. Until next time, face life's challenges like a sling-wielding shepherd boy.